Nervous system, the master controlling system, the communication system. This is where our bodies are sending and receiving signals. They're sending information. Anything that has to do with how we are communicating in different parts of our body, this is the nervous system. It could be about emergencies. It could be about information. It could be muscle contractions. We're talking about any type of material, any type of command that's being sent all over the body is happening from the nervous system. A couple of things that we know. We talked about back in the beginning of the semester. This is a rapid system. That means it is happening immediately. We don't have to wait on it. There's no time lapse really that we can judge. Now, yes, there is a small latent period between some of these actions, but we don't really even notice it very much. The other thing is very specific. We've talked about the thoughts before about stepping on a nail. And if I step on a nail, I know immediately I have an impulse that goes from my foot directly to my brain, and there's a reaction that's going to take place that makes my leg lift up. So that is a specific response, right? I don't throw my hand up if I step onto a nail. So what we're going to do is I just want to walk you through the nervous system. This is not going to be as stringent as being in class, but what I'll do is I'll walk through it just so you have the information. First of all, functions. We know that there are 3 different parts. There is a sensory input. That is information that goes to the brain. We listed this before as being afferent. A-F-F-E-R-N-T. Afferent information going to the brain. That's any information that's coming from the outside environment. It's anything about changes from external or really internal of your body that are going up to the brain to be computed. Then the second part of this is integration. Integration, of course, is the area of the control center within the brain, right? So integration, this is the processing center. This is how we are going to take that sensory information and determine a response from it. When we create a response, all we do is send out whatever the guidelines have to be for it. So an interpretation of a sensory, this could be a smell. So as I am walking along on the streets of New York City and I smell this wonderful smelling pizza, there is immediately information that is sent to my brain that says, hey, there's pizza over there and we should go get some, right? So that's integration. This is the processing center. It's the brain center. Remember, this is where all of our neuron cell bodies are located. Then the last part is the motor output. The motor output, of course, is going to utilize what is called the efferent pathway. Efferent, E-F-F-E-R-E-N-T. So that efferent pathway is anything that goes away from the brain. And you can see here it is activation of those organs. This could be muscles, it could be glands. Whatever is producing a response is going to use something called an effector organ. And typically we think of that as being muscles. If we're talking about producing a movement, that's going to be with skeletal muscles. If we're producing some type of action within the body, then of course it changes and we can create a different type. This is a quick example of what sensory pathway the reflex arc is going to look like. We see a glass of water. We put that input into the brain. The brain then determines a response of how we can pick it up. We then use our muscles and activate our muscles. You guys remember activation, right? We go through the activation process to actually create the pickup, and then we grab that water and take a drink. So, about my nervous system, what are my pieces of the nervous system? Of course, I've got 2 major divisions. There is the central nervous system and there's peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system is the brain and the spinal cord only. This is the brain and the spinal cord only. If there is anything having to do with the nervous system that is a part of the brain or a part of the spinal cord itself, that is the central nervous system, CNS. CNS. Now, what does that mean for the rest of it then? Anything that does not directly have to do with the brain or the spinal cord then comes from the peripheral nervous system, the PNS. This is a portion of the nervous system that's outside of the central nervous system. It's mostly your nerves. It's mostly the bundled up axons and dendrites that are extending off of your brain and your spinal cord. And they're going to be what's allowing for sensation or feeling in the body. The 2 biggest components of our peripheral nervous system are going to be the spinal nerves and the cranial nerves. Now, later on in a lab, you're going to get a chance to see the spinal or the cranial nerves a little bit more clearly, but we will talk about them in chapter 13, I believe it is also. The spinal nerves, you're not going to have to learn quite so intently. We will look at the groups of spinal nerves and where they're serving, or which part of the body they're servicing, but the cranial nerves is the one that we're going to spend more of our time on. So let's start with the peripheral nervous system, because we're actually spend chapter 12 to go through the central nervous system. We're going to bounce back and forth a little bit, so don't think that this is just one type of activity. But I do want to explain to you a few more things. I've already talked about the functional divisions here. You can see the sensory information versus motor information that goes along. Sensory, of course, is that afferent pathway, or the activity that goes directly to the brain, afferent, however you want to say it. And there are two different types. You can see somatic here or visceral. Somatic is anything that conveys impulses to the skin or the muscles. This is mostly what we consider voluntary. Okay? Somatic is going to be to the body portions that are voluntary. This second one, visceral sensory information is conveying impulses to the organs. So this is mostly going to be involuntary, right? Visceral being involuntary. So that's our sensory portions, any information that's going to the brain, okay? So this is coming from visceral organs to the CNS. You can see these from the skin and the muscles to the CNS. The motor division, the efferent division, is anything transmitting away from the brain. So you can see transmitting impulses from the CNS. So if we go from the CNS, of course, to the effectors, then we're going to be using mostly information that goes down to muscles or to glands here. There are two divisions that go along with that. There's somatic and autonomic. And I just gave you this information a second ago, right? Somatic means mostly voluntary, whereas autonomic is mostly going to be involuntary. Our somatic nervous system, you can see the voluntary nervous system conducting all impulses from the CNS to the skeletal muscles. I just went over this, basically just a little review part. Whereas the autonomic nervous system is mostly going to be your involuntary action. Now, involuntarily, with this autonomic nervous system, there are actually two divisions. There's sympathetic and parasympathetic. That's these two pieces here, but we'll actually talk about that more in chapter 14, so I don't want you to get caught too much up into that. You can see they do work in opposition to each other. When one's on, the other's off. Our body is in constant contraction and relaxation, right? And we can kind of think of it that way. There is sympathetic and there's parasympathetic division that are going to work with how our body reacts. This little flow chart's a pretty neat way for you to be able to see how the information is being sent. If you follow the blue arrows, you can see that this is sensory information going straight to the central nervous system. If you follow the red arrows, that's going to be efferent, or anything that's going out. And then if you look at the divisions we just talked about, here's the CNS versus the PNS, and then the PNS goes down to either your sensory coming in, your motor going out. Then the motor gets split up into somatic and autonomic, and then autonomic is split up into sympathetic and parasympathetic. We'll spend more time on this down in chapter 13. All right, histology. You should know about the histology of this nervous system already. We talked about neuroglia and neurons. They're the two biggest pieces and players here. The neurons are the chief cell. They're the principal cell. They're the ones that are mostly in charge of the action that's going to be taking place. They have responsibility for transmitting any information, whether that's a command, it's a muscle signal, it's any type of information that's coming from the brain or going to the brain that's going to go through these neurons. Neuroglia, these are the helper cells. You can see they wrap around the delicate neurons. What they do is they work actually as insulation. All right, so we have two different types of neuroglia listed here. One is going to be found in the central nervous system, and one is found in the central nervous system. Haha, you like how I did that? Okay, actually both of these are your central nervous system neuroglia. The first one is an astrocyte. And an astrocyte, what its main function is to do is actually to wrap around a cell body. Okay, wrap around a cell body. Remember, you have cell bodies and you have neuron processes. The cell body portion is where the genetic material is, the nucleus, and this astrocyte wraps around the cell body in the CNS. The second one is the oligodendrocytes. Oligodendrocytes wrap around the neuron processes. So oligodendrocytes around the processes, the axon, the dendrites, whatever is available there, mostly around axons. The astrocytes, they wrap around the neuron cell bodies. They produce what are called myelin sheaths. Here's what they look like. This is going to be a neuron cell body. Now, most of the time we think of these as being star-shaped, and so don't get wrapped up in what it looks like. But this would be an astrocyte here, and then over here, this would be oligodendrocytes wrapped around the cell processes. Here are your two types that are found in the peripheral nervous system. The first is called a satellite cell, and it functions just like a astrocyte. It wraps around the cell bodies in the PNS, so functions just like this astrocyte right here. Okay? The Schwann cells are going to function just like the oligodendrocytes. They're going to wrap around the neuron cell processes that are found anywhere else in the body, anywhere outside of the CNS. So that's a Schwann cell. What do they look like? Here's a satellite cell. This is going to be wrapping around a neuron cell body versus a Schwann cell, which are these little bubble-like projections that we see here. Now, one thing I do want you to remember is we said 99% of our neuron cell bodies are found inside the CNS. That means we're not going to find very many of these satellite cells because only about 1% of neurons are found outside of the CNS. What we will find a ton of, though, are these axons that are outside, and there's going to be a lot of Schwann cells. Most of the time we're going to be focusing mostly on Schwann cells. So that kind of brings us into our neurons. What are we talking about neurons? These are the really impressive cells that send and receive information. They are able to communicate effectively, and they are constantly working. The other thing is they have extreme longevity. They can last a long time, which is really important to us because we know that they are amitotic, meaning they do not undergo mitosis, right? They're not producing any new cells once we are born. So we have to remember that it's impressive for them to be lasting for upwards of hundreds of years. You know, we know about some of these elderly people that are living over 100 years. They're still able to fire off synapses and fire off all this information from their neurons. It's pretty impressive, okay? What we're going to find is that all have a cell body and either have one or more process. If they only have one process, that is called an axon. If they have multiple process, the first one, the largest one, is called the axon. Anything after that will be called a dendrite. Now, the neuron cell body itself, most of them, as I said before, are lying within the CNS, and then they're going to have their axons or their processes that are in the PNS. The axons and processes are something called ganglia. So when you see that term ganglia, it's just simply referring to the pieces that are outside. Here are the pieces of neuron processes that you would find, little arm-like extensions that come off of the body. Typically in the CNS, you'll find the cell body and a process. The PNS is mostly going to be the processes, right? Because I just said 99% of cell bodies are found inside the CNS. If we find a bundle of neurons in the PNS, the peripheral nervous system, that's called a nerve. That's what we think of as being our nerves. They send and receive signals to our muscles. We have information or feelings that go through them. That's a nerve. We have the same sort of thing up in our CNS, a bundle of neuron processes in the CNS, but up there it's called a tract. All right. Most of the time we're going to be referring to the axons because these are the biggest part. They're able to send and receive signals, whereas this dendrite just is a receptive region. This is that neuron. This is a multipolar neuron. You can see that it's got an axon and then it's got a whole bunch of dendrites. Here is our neuron cell body with a nucleus inside. And then, of course, this is our axon that's covered in these Schwann cells. This is a perfect example of a multipolar neuron, and you will see this on your exam. So make sure that you get to know this. Now, one of the things you don't see on here, there's no Schwann cell or there's no astrocyte. And that's okay, but we know that that would be around the cell body itself here. Notice also that the dendrites are not coded in these Schwann cells. Schwann cells are mostly held for just the axon. Down here at the end, there's an axon terminal, right? If we remember an axon terminal, we found those at an NMJ, neuromuscular junction. We could find them lots of different places, all right? We will move on.